All right, let's jump right into this explainer and see how a book called The Fish Creek Forum completely flips the script on what a middle grade book can be. We're going to explore a really fascinating piece of literature that just throws out the traditional rulebook. It asks a pretty fun question. How do you actually capture the attention of today's reluctant young readers? Well, it turns out the answer is wonderfully chaotic.
So, think about it for a second. What pops into your head when you hear middle grade fantasy? You know, usually we expect noble quests, magical realms, and earnest young heroes fulfilling some kind of ancient world-saving prophecy, right? We expect swords, sorcery, really high stakes. And hey, it's a formula that has worked for decades, but it can also feel a bit heavy and honestly, maybe even a little intimidating for a kid who just isn't naturally drawn to reading massive epics.
But man, the contrast here is just staggering. Instead of your typical castles, wands, and the standard chosen one trope, the Fish Creek Forum plops us right on the Georgia-Alabama border. It gives us fake news and a highly sarcastic student named Emmett Marie who's running a local newspaper. There's absolutely no chosen one here. There are just hyper-local scandals, highly annoying pests, and a town completely losing its mind. It's quite literally a masterclass in subverting expectations.
Okay, let's move into our first major point, the newspaper narrative, and how this book abandons traditional prose for chaotic journalism. Because to really understand how different this is from a standard fantasy novel, we have to look at the structure itself. It's really not a novel in the traditional sense at all.
The whole thing is driven entirely by this absolutely wild newspaper layout. I mean, forget chapters. Instead, we get forewords from the editor-in-chief giving completely confusing instructions, like telling you to read the afterword first. We get fake ads, wildly unhelpful public service announcements from the local mayor, Mayor McFlamble, and an aggressive regional index of Southern colloquialisms that actually insults the reader for not knowing what boogwallops are. It literally forces you to interact with the text not as a passive observer, but as a subscriber to a ridiculous local paper.
And the way the book uses letters to the editor to build out its absurd world is just brilliant. Like, get this, there's a formal complaint from the local tooth fairy citing yellow journalism and poor oral hygiene. The author doesn't spend 20 pages describing the magical rules of the universe. Instead, he just drops in this hilarious passive-aggressive note to the editor.
Here's another great one from the Raccoon Psychological Society. It's just so snappy. It captures that weird episodic energy of local gossip perfectly, letting the satire speak for itself through these hilarious interruptions. It's essentially world-building through bureaucracy and local complaints. It takes the mundane elements of adult life, like, writing a grumpy letter to the local paper, and filters them through the lens of middle school absurdity.
Moving on to our next section, a southern mutated bestiary. This is where we trade mythical beasts for rural pests. Instead of standard magical creatures soaring through the sky, the author gives us a highly localized, deeply annoying set of mutated pests that terrorize the town. They aren't trying to destroy the world. They're literally just trying to ruin your Tuesday.
Because the villains here, they aren't dark lords. They're annoying little tricksters like the Hoodlywink. And what exactly does a Hoodlywink do? Well, it shaves a skunk, traps the local teacher in a stump hole, disguises itself as the educator, and then intentionally teaches children that 2 times 2 is 5, and that BOCKS spells box. Their ultimate evil plan is just to make kids fail math class.
And then you've got the Wigglum worms from Big Fish Lake. Not giant sea serpents, just mutated earthworms that only start wiggling after they've been eaten. The result? It turns a regular local fish fry into a medical emergency of uncontrollable jitterbugging, which is known locally as the boogie-woogie flu.
Or take the spotted blue armadillo. Again, no fire-breathing dragons here, right? Instead, you have a weird mutated armadillo that literally springs out of a school desk like a ninja to give a student an unwanted kiss and a face full of blue spots. It's that perfect gross-out humor absolutely calibrated for a 12-year-old's sensibilities.
But my absolute favorite has to be the Hambino. This creature is the perfect example of poetic justice in this universe. The Hambino is a wild, mean, pig-like creature that bites school bullies on the ankles, magically forcing them to scream exclusively in pig Latin for a week. I mean, come on, it's completely ridiculous, highly localized, and deeply, deeply funny.
Okay, on to Section 3, the author is the joke. To understand why this explainer gets truly fascinating, we have to look at the ultimate meta-narrative subversion here. Because to see why this book works so well, we really need to find out who is actually taking the brunt of all this chaos. Because you have to ask yourself,
Who is the main target of all these monsters and local scandals? In a normal fantasy story, the monsters attack the hero, or, the innocent villagers. But who suffers the most in the town of Fish Creek? Who's at the absolute center of all the misery?
Well, it's actually Mr. Coley, the bumbling local school teacher. And here's the absolute kicker. The actual author of the book, John Coley, literally wrote himself into his own story just to be endlessly tortured by his own fictional students. He makes himself the punchline of his own joke. The entire book is essentially a hilarious exercise in kids trashing their educator. I mean, the guy gets his foot stuck in a hole and tickle tortured by a monster. He gets sneeze-bombed and covered head to toe in boog wallops by a mutated porcupine. And his only defense against this whole chaotic universe is pulling out a giant oak paddle, literally inscribed with the words Board of Education, to scare the monsters away. He totally strips away his own authority just to let the kids have all the power.
So for our final section, let's talk about why this format actually matters, especially for engaging those reluctant middle grade readers. Why does it matter that a book completely abandons the standard hero's journey for fake news and teacher torture?
Well, the author actually spills his secret in the afterword, saying, imagine, if you will, a young teacher discovering that one of his students is the editor of a local independent newspaper. Oh, the horror! By framing the story as a real teacher's absolute worst nightmare, he aligns perfectly with that mischievous, rebellious energy of middle schoolers. He is sitting right there on their side of the classroom.
And that brings us to the ultimate takeaway here. Welcome to the wonderful world of education, where the stories are incredulous, the logic is completely absurd, and the students basically run the press. It completely removes the intimidation factor of a massive fantasy epic and replaces it with bite-sized, sarcastic, and highly accessible humor. You don't have to commit to a 500-page quest, you just have to read a few unhinged articles about a kid getting glued to her desk with snapping turtle pine sap.
Which leaves us with a really fascinating question to chew on. Could this kind of fake news and hyperlocal satire actually be the secret weapon to get reluctant middle schoolers reading again? If traditional tropes are failing to capture a kid's attention, maybe they just don't need another prophesied hero with a magic sword. Maybe, just maybe, a little fake news, a sneezing porcupine, and a sassy 12-year-old editor is exactly what they need to fall in love with reading for the first time.